My billionaire father said the poorest child would inherit everything. So the night before he died, my rich siblings emptied their bank accounts. But I knew the one rule. He never said out loud, and by morning, the fortune was already gone. I grew up knowing my father, Richard Halston, loved control more than he loved money. And that's saying something, because in our city, his name was basically a synonym for money. If you drove past the glass tower downtown with Halston Global across the top, that was him. If you invested in clean energy, logistics, private defense contracts, odds were you were somehow tied to him. My father built an empire out of nothing and never let us forget it. There were 4 of us. Olivia, the oldest, married into old European wealth and curated her life like an art exhibit. Marcus ran a venture capital firm and loved being interviewed about disruption and innovation. Daniel pretended to be humble but owned 3 penthouses and a vineyard in Napa. And then there was me, the disappointment, the nonprofit kid, the one who worked with housing charities and refused to join the family business. For years, my father told us the same thing. Money reveals who you really are. He said it at birthdays, at board dinners, at Thanksgiving while carving turkey with a gold-handled knife. We rolled our eyes, but he never stopped repeating it. When he was diagnosed with a terminal heart condition, he called us all to the estate. The house sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean, cold and modern and intimidating. We gathered in the library, the 4 of us lined up like we were children again. He looked thinner, but his eyes were sharp. He told us he had updated his will. He said the entire controlling stake of Halston Global, the properties, the offshore holdings, everything, would go to the poorest child. We thought he was joking. He wasn't. He said the inheritance would be determined 48 hours after his death. Net worth would be calculated based on verified assets, liabilities, holdings, everything traceable. Whoever had the lowest net worth would inherit it all. Olivia laughed first. Marcus started arguing about valuation methods. Daniel asked about trusts and debt restructuring. I just watched him. He leaned back in his chair and said there was one more thing. The lawyers would not accept transfers made in bad faith to manipulate net worth. He didn't define bad faith. He didn't have to. Within an hour of that meeting ending, my siblings were on their phones. Marcus began liquidating positions. Daniel started moving property into shell companies. Olivia transferred art and jewelry into her husband's family trust. They were frantic, but polished about it. They'd grown up around lawyers. They knew how to make millions disappear on paper. I went back to my small apartment in the city. I didn't touch my accounts. I didn't sell my car. I didn't move a cent, because I knew something they didn't. Our father had always told me something different when we were alone. He used to visit the community center I worked at. He'd stand in the doorway, watching families line up for rental assistance. Once he told me that poverty isn't about what you have, it's about what you owe. At the time, I thought he meant emotional debt, regret, guilt. But as I sat in my apartment that night, I started thinking about the companies he owned, about Halston Global's debt structure, about the subsidiaries most people didn't know existed. My siblings were focused on reducing their personal net worth. They weren't asking what was about to happen to the company itself. 2 days later, my father died in his sleep. The media exploded. Financial networks speculated about succession. Analysts debated which of us would take over. 48 hours later, we were back in the estate library with the attorneys. A forensic accounting team had prepared reports on each of us. Olivia had successfully divested almost everything. On paper, she was worth less than $1 million. Marcus had structured massive loans against his own assets, making his net worth appear close to zero. Daniel had transferred properties and taken on strategic debt that technically made him slightly negative. I hadn't done anything. My net worth was modest but stable. Compared to them, I looked wealthy. They smiled at me like I'd already lost. Then, the lead attorney cleared his throat. He said before the calculation could be finalized, there was a corporate event that needed to be disclosed. Halston Global had executed a pre-scheduled restructuring plan triggered upon my father's death. The room went silent. The restructuring converted a significant portion of corporate debt into personal guarantees attached to the controlling shareholder at the moment of transfer. Marcus frowned. He said that didn't make sense. The attorney continued. The will specified that the poorest child would inherit the controlling stake immediately upon certification of lowest net worth. However, the act of inheriting the controlling stake automatically transferred the corporate guarantees. In simple terms, whoever won would also personally guarantee billions in corporate debt. Olivia's face drained of color. Daniel started calculating out loud. Marcus accused the lawyers of manipulation, but it was all legal, perfectly timed, filed months before. My father hadn't just created a contest to see who could look the poorest. He had created a trap. If one of them had succeeded in becoming technically the poorest, they would have inherited the empire and instantly become personally liable for debt that dwarfed their private safety nets. Their frantic asset dumping had made them fragile. The attorney finished the numbers. After adjusting for bad faith transfers that were reversed under the will's provisions, the calculations shifted. Olivia's art transfers were flagged as reversible. Marcus's loans were deemed self-dealing and adjusted. Daniel's shell company moves were invalidated. In the end, after all corrections, Daniel had the lowest legitimate net worth. He had won. And in winning, he inherited Halston Global and its newly activated personal guarantees. The attorney slid the final document across the table. Daniel stared at it like it was a bomb, because it was. The guarantees tied him personally to over $3 billion in structured obligations. If the company performed flawlessly, he'd be fine. If it faltered, he would lose everything. His vineyard, his penthouses, his carefully curated humble persona. My father had always said money reveals who you are. Daniel's hands were shaking. Marcus looked furious but also relieved. Olivia was already whispering to her husband on the phone. And me? I finally understood. My father hadn't wanted the poorest child. He had wanted the one willing to carry the weight. In the weeks that followed, Halston Global stock dipped. Markets hate uncertainty. Credit agencies reviewed the guarantees. Journalists began digging into the restructuring. Daniel called me late one night. He asked if I thought our father hated us. I said no. I said he was testing us. Daniel confessed he had never actually wanted the company. He just wanted to win, to prove he was smarter. Now he couldn't sleep. Every market fluctuation felt personal. 3 months later, a major government contract stalled. The company's liquidity tightened. Analysts started using the word crisis. Daniel had a choice: cut thousands of jobs to stabilize cash flow, or refinance at punishing rates that would erode long-term value. He called a family meeting. For the first time, he didn't sound arrogant. He said he couldn't do it alone. Marcus offered strategic restructuring advice, but demanded equity. Olivia suggested selling divisions to European partners. It became a negotiation, not a family discussion. I asked one question: what would Dad do? Silence. We all knew the answer. He would protect the core business and sacrifice personal comfort before sacrificing the workforce. That's how he built loyalty. Daniel surprised us. He announced he was selling his vineyard and 2 penthouses to inject personal capital and stabilize the company without layoffs. Marcus called him reckless. Olivia called him dramatic. I saw something else. For the first time, Daniel wasn't trying to look rich or poor. He was taking responsibility. The markets responded cautiously at first, then positively. Confidence returned. The crisis eased. Months later, Daniel invited me back to the estate. The house felt different, less like a throne room, more like a home. He told me he finally understood the unspoken rule. Our father never said the poorest child would inherit the fortune. He said the poorest, and poverty isn't a number on a balance sheet. It's the inability to carry consequences. Daniel said he used to think wealth meant never feeling risk. Now he realized real wealth meant being strong enough to absorb it. Before I left, he handed me a folder. Inside was a proposal to spin off a significant portion of Halston Global's profits into a permanent housing endowment. He said Dad would have hated it at first, then secretly admired it. As I drove away from the estate, I thought about that night in the library, about how desperate we all were to look poor. In the end, the fortune didn't go to the one with the least money. It went to the one who stopped trying to escape the weight of it. And maybe that was the only rule my father ever really cared about. When the housing endowment was announced, the headlines called it Redemption. Halston Air funds historic affordable housing initiative. Daniel was suddenly the responsible billionaire son. Analysts praised his long-term thinking. Politicians wanted photo ops. For the first time since our father died, the narrative felt positive. But I knew better, because 3 weeks after the announcement, I received an anonymous email with no subject line and one attachment. Inside was a scanned memo dated 6 months before our father's death. It outlined something called Project Atlas. The memo described a controlled market contraction strategy. If executed properly, Halston Global could intentionally depress its own stock, trigger specific debt clauses, and consolidate smaller competitors at a discount. Risky, aggressive, ruthless. At the bottom of the memo was my father's signature, and one line circled in red. Primary risk bearer must have uncompromised personal exposure. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Primary risk bearer Daniel. The restructuring wasn't just a moral test, it was positioning. I drove straight to the estate. Daniel looked exhausted. The endowment launch had him traveling nonstop. When I showed him the memo, he went quiet in a way I'd never seen before. He admitted he'd heard whispers about Atlas, but assumed it died with our father. It hadn't, because the next morning, Halston Global stock dropped 12% after a sudden announcement that one of its major divisions would be spun off, underperforming assets included. The media framed it as strategic realignment. But I saw the pattern: depress valuation, trigger debt leverage, acquire competitors. Daniel called Marcus. Marcus didn't sound surprised. He said the board had been discussing aggressive expansion to solidify market dominance. With Daniel personally guaranteeing debt, lenders were offering terms they never would have before Daniel was the shield. If it worked, Halston Global would become untouchable. If it failed, Daniel would be personally destroyed. For the first time, I felt anger toward my father. He hadn't just tested us. He had engineered a scenario where one of his children would become a human firewall for a corporate war plan. Daniel requested an emergency board meeting. I insisted on attending as an observer through the endowment partnership clause. The boardroom felt colder than the estate library ever had. PowerPoint slides replaced sympathy. Market share projections replaced grief. One director referred to Daniel as strategically aligned collateral. I watched my brother's jaw tighten. They walked through Atlas step by step. Short-term volatility, media spin, leveraged acquisitions. By the end of the presentation, it was brilliant. It was brutal. Daniel asked a simple question. What happens if the market doesn't recover fast enough? Silence, one director finally answered. Then personal guarantees activate, meaning Daniel's private assets would be liquidated first to stabilize obligations. The board framed it as shared sacrifice, but they weren't sacrificing their vineyards. After the meeting, Daniel and I sat in his office overlooking the city. He looked smaller somehow, even in that massive chair. He said Dad always told him he wasn't ruthless enough to run the company. Maybe Atlas was proof I told him there was another option. Don't execute it. He laughed softly. You think the board will just walk away from that kind of upside? I reminded him of something our father said to me once. Control isn't about forcing outcomes. It's about choosing which risks you refuse to take. That night, Daniel did something none of us expected. He publicly announced that Halston Global would not pursue Atlas and would instead prioritize long-term stability over aggressive consolidation. The market reacted instantly. Stock fell again. Financial commentators called him weak. Anonymous sources leaked that internal disagreements were fracturing leadership. Marcus called furious, accusing Daniel of sabotaging growth. Olivia texted that European investors were pulling back. For a week, it looked like Daniel had made a catastrophic mistake. Credit pressure increased. Analysts downgraded projections. Social media labeled him the soft heir. Then something shifted. A smaller competitor attempted a similar contraction strategy and miscalculated. Their stock collapsed. Debt spiraled. Within days, they were facing bankruptcy. Had Halston executed Atlas at the same time, market panic could have multiplied losses across the sector. Daniel watched the news in silence. The board requested another emergency meeting. This time, the tone was different. They weren't discussing expansion. They were discussing survival, because investors began rewarding stability. Funds flowed toward companies that avoided extreme leverage. Halston's refusal to execute Atlas became a signal of restraint. Within months, the stock recovered. Not explosively, but steadily. Daniel's personal guarantees remained, but the immediate threat diminished. One evening, back at the estate, he asked me if I thought Dad planned for this too. If Atlas was bait, if the real test wasn't about who could carry debt, but who would refuse to weaponize it. I thought about the memo, about that circled line. Primary risk bearer must have uncompromised personal exposure. Maybe Dad believed that only someone who could truly lose everything would hesitate before risking everything. Maybe he engineered the guarantees so that none of us could treat the company like a casino. Weeks later, Daniel made another announcement. He was restructuring executive compensation to tie bonuses to employee retention and community investment metrics, not just stock performance. The board resisted. Investors questioned it, but employees responded with loyalty I hadn't seen before. For the first time since our father's death, Halston Global felt less like a machine and more like a responsibility. One night, as we stood on the cliff overlooking the ocean, Daniel said something that stayed with me. He said when Dad declared the poorest child would inherit everything, we all thought poverty meant money. But real poverty is insecurity disguised as power. Marcus is still chasing headlines. Olivia still measures worth in appearances. I used to think I was the only one who understood Dad. I was wrong. The inheritance wasn't a fortune, it was exposure. And the real twist wasn't who became the poorest. It was who decided not to become ruthless. Because in the end, the only thing more dangerous than being rich is being powerful without anything left to lose.